This is the story you've heard about, talked about. The spine-tingling, blood-chilling story that stuns your emotions. Frankenstein.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Dr. Frankenstein! Are you all right?
My name is Frankenstein!
Everyone knows something about Frankenstein. The archetype horror movie monster, subject of countless retellings, imitations and parodies from Boris Karloff to Gene Wilder and beyond. But what about the birth of the story, which is now seen as perhaps the first horror novel, the first work of what would become known as science fiction, and for today's readers, still one of the most thought-provoking tales about artificial intelligence? As we'll hear, Frankenstein was born not in a mad scientist's laboratory, but in a genteel villa on the outskirts of genteel Geneva. On this podcast, I go in search of reminders that Frankenstein is a child of the city I now call home, and I speak to a couple of superfans of the book along the way.
Frankenstein is a profoundly geographical novel, and of course it ends up in the North Pole and it goes to Scotland, but it's very much focused on Geneva and the Alps, and that was all to do with Mary Shelley's state of mind when she was here writing it.
Author Catherine Ferns, like me, an expat Brit living in Geneva, joins me to contemplate what the monster really looked like.
I think he's supposed to be really scary looking and horrific. And that's a wonderful contrast with how eloquent he is. He's by far the most intelligent character in the book.
And as the retelling of Frankenstein goes on, we meet another author who's just published her fictionalised version of how Mary Shelley, at just 18 and hanging out with rakish romantic poets Byron and Shelley on a fateful holiday on the shores of Lake Geneva, created a monster.
In Dutch we say a droste effect. It's like an image inside an image, inside an image, inside an image. And that's like what this feels like. You've got Mary Shelley, who is writing Frankenstein, which is also a sort of a birth itself, like Dr. Frankenstein gave birth to the monster. And there I am giving birth to a story about Mary Shelley, who's giving birth. That felt really good to do.
This is a podcast about birth and death and everything in between and beyond. Join me in Geneva in the footsteps of Frankenstein.
The greatest single contribution to science since the creation of fire!
So I've come in search of the birthplace of Frankenstein, and instead of being a dark and stormy night, it's actually a sunny, beautiful day, and I'm sitting in what's called Byron's Field. It's a steep, hilly piece of grass left for wildflowers to grow. You can hear children playing behind me, and as I look down at the lake, it's calm and placid. I see a couple of little pleasure boats there. Across on the other side is the United Nations. Behind that is the Jura mountain range, and behind me the other side, if I were to walk a little bit up the hill, I'd be over the top of this hill and look out to the Alps with Mont Blanc visible on a clear day like this. And the reason I'm here is because to my left is a place called Villa Diodati. There's a very nice large house, and that is Villa Diodati. I can't go in, it's a private residence, as it was 200 years ago when Lord Byron rented it for his summer holiday. And that's why this is called Byron's Field. And on one of the properties at Villa Diodati, you can look up and see a fairly simple marble plaque which reads in French, Lord Byron, English poet, author of The Prisoner of Chillon, lived in the Villa Diodati in 1816, where he wrote the third canto of Childe Harold. Lord Byron was a poet, but he wasn't just a poet, he was a superstar of his day. Childe Harold was among his greatest hits, and reportedly, when people found out that he was staying here at the house I'm looking at right now, on the other side of the lake, they would grab their binoculars and peer over to try and get a glimpse of this man. It's a shame photography hadn't been invented yet, because that's where the paparazzi would have hung out. So what was Byron doing here? He was travelling with his doctor, a young man called John Polidori, whose medical qualifications probably came in handy for the administration of laudanum, which was the fashionable recreational drug of the day. They were joined here in Coligny by a couple, an upcoming poet, Percy Shelley, and his lover, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and their baby son. Percy Shelley was already married, but he'd taken up with Mary a couple of years earlier when she was only 16. Percy and Mary stayed in a more modest house. They weren't staying in Villa Diodati, they were just down the hill here at a place called Maison Chapuis, which has long since disappeared. And there was one other adult making up this group of English holidaymakers, Claire Claremont, and she was Mary's stepsister, the daughter of Mary's stepmother. Mary's own mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died of complications from the birth, of giving birth to Mary just a few days after she was born. Like I said, life and death are very much a theme of this story. So Mary Wollstonecraft, by the way, like her daughter, was a remarkable and unconventional woman in her thinking and in her life. She was the author of a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, way back in 1792. She's seen today as one of the founders of feminism. But back to Coligny, where I'm sitting now, it was Claire, Mary's stepsister, who had brought together the up-and-coming poet Percy Shelley with the superstar Byron. Part of the motive for bringing them together, history tells us, is that Claire was trying to rekindle a romance with the rakish, desirable Lord Byron. So it was here, although not on a bright sunny day, but on a dark and stormy night, that Frankenstein was born. This is from the Shelleys' memoir of the time. The thunderstorms that visit us are grander and more terrific than I've ever seen before. We watch them as they approach from the opposite side of the lake, observing the lightning play among the clouds in various parts of the heavens, and dart in jagged figures upon the piney heights of Jura, dark with the shadow of the overhanging cloud, while perhaps the sun is shining cheerily upon us. One night we enjoyed a finer storm than I had ever before beheld. The lake was lit up, the pines on Jura made visible, and all the scene illuminated for an artist, when a pitchy blackness succeeded, and the thunder came in frightful bursts over our heads amid the darkness. Why was it dark and stormy? Well, because 1816, history tells us, was a remarkable year. It's a year that's called the year without a summer. And the reason for that is that the previous year there'd been a huge volcanic eruption, perhaps the biggest one in human history, in what's now Indonesia. And the explosion there of Mount Tambora was so huge that it created its own global climate change. Temperatures around the globe dropped as the ash and dust that had spewed out of this volcano literally blocked out the sun, and the effects were felt right around the world. There were crop failures and disease outbreaks wreaking havoc. So it might seem that the resulting poor weather for the summer holidaying tourists from England was relatively insignificant. But for the purposes of our story here, it was pretty significant. I'm going to read from an article I found on the website of the publisher Penguin. The article has a great title. It's called Ghost Stories, Opium and Rain, the Doomed Holiday That Inspired Shelley's Frankenstein. And it says, the bizarre combination of circumstances that led Mary to put pen to paper, volcanic eruptions, latent desire, over-ambitious excursions and unscrupulous publishers all collided in what became the most productive and most unfortunate holiday in literary history. Our merry fivesome, that's Mary and Percy, Byron and Dr. Polidori, and the stepsister Claire, were forced inside, swapping crystalline mountainscapes for increasingly claustrophobic gatherings inside Byron's villa. In an attempt to pass the time, they consumed plenty of wine and laudanum, liquid opium, and to add to the general feeling of delirium, started to read creepy poems aloud to one another. Some volumes of ghost stories translated from the German into French fell into our hands. Mary recorded 15 years later. It proved an intoxicating combination. Shelley ended up shrieking out of the room after hallucinating that Mary's nipples had turned into demonic eyes. Nevertheless, the japes continued. Byron set his friends a challenge to write a ghost story of their own. The results were unexpected. Byron, arguably the most accomplished and lauded writer of the bunch, I don't think that's arguably, it's definitely true, rattled out a rather underwhelming vampire story. Shelley, another poet of merit, swiftly abandoned the task after embarking on a story based on his childhood. After a slow start, poor Polidori had some terrible idea about a skull-headed lady, according to Mary. The Doctor managed to flex his creative writing skills in conjuring up the vampire, a story that would later inspire Bram Stoker to create Dracula. Polidori's central character, the blood-sucking, philandering Lord Ruthven, bears a remarkable resemblance to Byron. But it was Mary's creation for which the trip is most famous. Roundly considered the birth of science fiction, Frankenstein emerged in fittingly Gothic style. After listening to Shelley and Byron dissect the possibility of whether corpses could be animated, Mary, perhaps unsurprisingly, had a fitful night. Some interpret her diaries as her suffering from insomnia. Others, nightmares, in which she saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life. In either case, the next storm-laden night, she had a story to read to the group. So there we have it. The place where I'm standing now is the birthplace of Frankenstein's monster, of Frankenstein, and even, arguably, of Dracula. And there's not much here to remind the visitor that it is the birthplace of Frankenstein. Although there's a plaque to Byron on the wall of Villa Diodati, and in Byron's field, inscribed on a large boulder, there's his name, celebrating the centenary of him staying here. The only thing I can see that refers to Mary Shelley is a much more modern sign. It's written in French and English. It says it was put up in November 2002, and it does say, "We're happy to welcome you to this very beautiful site." On this very spot, the story of Frankenstein was born. And it gives a bit of the detail. It's hardly a grand memorial to the birth of a cornerstone of modern culture. Maybe I can find something else, a monument, or at least a reminder of Geneva's links to Frankenstein, if I head more centrally into the city. You're listening to A Book, a Place, Geneva, Episode 1, Frankenstein. So my search for reminders of Frankenstein in Geneva takes me to Plainpalais, an enormous market square in the centre of the town, and there I meet author, fellow expat Brit and Frankenstein superfan Catherine Ferns as we look into the eyes of the monster. So I'm standing in Plainpalais, which is a vast kind of a marketplace, I guess, but there doesn't seem to be a market today. We're next to the skateboard park. I'm joined by Catherine Ferns, who's joined me here to talk about Frankenstein, because in front of us here is Frankenstein. Can you tell it where? Should we go over and have a look and see what he looks like? So he's towering a foot or two above me, this bronze sculpture. Have you seen this one before?
Yes, in fact, I often come to pay my respects to this sculpture because he's very lonely in this position. I think size-wise, he's very true to the book because he's about 8 feet tall, but he's quite modern with his jeans and his jacket. And if you stand right in front of him, he seems to be really staring at you, and he looks so desolate.
He does. He looks sad, right? So he's a humanoid figure stitched together by body parts. As you say, he's wearing jeans. The fly seems to be ripped open. His torso is on display with stitches all the way up, with nipples that look like they've been sewn on, and then this face. How would you describe that? Desolate, you said.
Yeah, there's a mixture of horror, anger, and sadness there. And I think this is exactly the right spot for them to put the statue, because this would have been where he murdered the little boy William in the book. So I can imagine from his expression he might have just done it, and he's appalled at himself and humanity. And I like the way that he's facing the Salève, so you can imagine that he's on his way to escape over the top of the Salève. We can't see it today.
We can't see the Salève. I've just turned, so I'm looking the way Frankenstein's monsters are looking. Normally, can you see it from here, then, the Salève?
You can see the top of it, and in Mary Shelley's time there wouldn't have been all these buildings in the way, so it would have been a bit easier for her to imagine him sort of suddenly scampering over the top, when in fact it is a few miles away from here.
So what is the geographical relevance of Geneva? Now, we know it was written here, at least the first draft was written in Coligny, which is a village or even a suburb, you might say, just outside the centre of Geneva. But, like you say, Plainpalais is very interesting. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book because Professor Frank, or Dr. Frankenstein, is that what we call him? I think was born in Geneva, the fictional character, but then he built the monster somewhere else in Switzerland and kind of returned pursuing him here. Is that what happened?
Yeah, kind of. He went away from Geneva to do his crazy studies in Ingolstadt, I think, in Germany, and then, horrified at what he'd done, he came back, but the monster finds him. So yeah, I mean, Frankenstein is a profoundly geographical novel, and of course it ends up in the North Pole and it goes to Scotland, but it's very much focused on Geneva and the Alps, and that was all to do with Mary Shelley's state of mind when she was here writing it.
So we mentioned the Salève. I should just say to people who don't know, we're also going to talk about that again in a moment. Is it a mountain? It's a very big hill with a very steep cliff. And for me, reading Frankenstein for the first time fairly recently, it's one of the passages that really stayed with me. What do you remember about the Salève? Because I know you've visited it as well, as I have, as pretty much anyone who lives in Geneva, they've been to the Salève. What does it mean to you in terms of the book? What do you remember about that passage?
It's... Yeah, it was a very tragic part because it was very well described the way that he's sort of clambering over those cliff faces in the dark and escaping. And the Salève is kind of a gateway to the Alps. It's sort of the last bastion of Geneva before we get into the very beautiful countryside of the Alps. And so, yeah, it's kind of a wall that he climbs over to escape from the city.
Should we go somewhere warmer and carry on this conversation in a cafe? It's a bit chilly, so we'll leave this place. It's funny though, people walk past this, I think a lot of people just don't notice it, right? It was put here, I don't know, about 10 years ago maybe? Yeah. Is there even a plaque anywhere about it?
No, it's very unassuming actually. It's very lonely, and I think that's appropriate because Frankenstein embodies abandonment and the archetypal outsider, so I think that's quite effective, but it's also quite sad as well, so I like to visit him as often as I can.
Just seeing there's a bolt going, it's going through, is it like an earring rather than one going right through his neck, Boris Karloff style?
Punk, yeah.
It's quite punk. Yeah, beautiful and hideous, frightening and sad. Okay, let's go and find a coffee and we can talk a bit more if you've got a time. So Plainpalais, which is enormous, but you get the impression from the book it was pretty much fields here back then, right? Do you have any idea what it looked like back in the time of the book?
Yeah, I think it was a kind of recreational space then as well. They had set it up with avenues and lines of trees and spaces to play games, but all of these buildings weren't here, so it would have been countryside and fields between here and the Salève. And the reason it was called Plainpalais was actually because it had been a marsh before, and it's hard to imagine, but the Arve had actually flooded this area several times, so it's quite low-lying. And I think Plainpalais sounds very grand. I always associate it with the palace, but it's actually named after a marsh.
Okay. And the Arve, it's the river Arve, which for people who don't know the geography of Geneva, obviously everyone knows about Lake Geneva, which flows out as a river, which is the River Rhône, which then flows through France into the Mediterranean. But joining the Rhône, just after it leaves the lake, is the River Arve, which comes all the way down from the French Alps and from Chamonix. And that's something you've been interested in as well, right?
Yes, and that's what led me back to Frankenstein, actually, because I took the same journey that Dr. Frankenstein and his monster took. One was chasing the other up to the Mer de Glace. But even before that, I'd always really identified with the Arve, which is the sort of lesser dowdy river of Geneva, as opposed to the beautiful turquoise, crystal clear Rhone. The Arve is a milky grey colour because it carries so much sediment, and it's associated with being turbulent and impetuous and out of control, and very much this sort of troublesome wife of the Rhone, and indeed at the Jonction it eventually gets swallowed up by the Rhone.
Yeah.
So I became quite fixated on the Arve, and it was the perfect way to connect with Frankenstein.
Yeah, and if you stand on that bridge that goes over the river, where should we go to find a cafe down here? You can see it's really interesting because you've got the two rivers meeting, and they stay for a little while. They actually stay two rivers that are joined because, as you say, the Rhone is crystal clear because any sediment has fallen to the bottom of Lake Geneva, whereas the Arve is milky white because of all that limestone sediment.
It's quite hard to take in when you first see the Jonction, and it almost, some people associate the two rivers as having a love affair and joining together. I sort of interpret it differently, and I see the Arve as having a bit of a struggle because it really doesn't want to join the Rhone until it eventually gets swallowed up. So that's just my feminist interpretation of the Arve.
Okay, is the Arve Venus and the Rhone Mars, or is it the other way around?
Oh, it's definitely that way around,
okay.
Yes.
All right, should we go into Épidoré?
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 Let's do it.
Let's try it. Bonjour.
Bonjour. Cappuccino, s'il vous plaît.
Et un renversé. Something to eat?
Oh, those are amazing.
Yeah. Do you want one?
No, I must.
Okay. Let me get this. Okay, so we're in the cafe now. So, Catherine, what do you know about the creation of the book Frankenstein? You know, Mary Shelley was here. What do you know about who she was with, and why the circumstances maybe led to the creation of this particularly very dark, gothic horror novel?
Well, Mary Shelley herself said later in her life, when she was writing later editions of the book, how could people imagine that an 18-year-old girl could think of these horrible ideas? But in fact, the origins of the book have become as legendary as the story itself. And when we think about what she was going through at that time, it all kind of makes sense. She was only 18. She had left England in disgrace, running away with Shelley, unmarried. She had suffered the terrible loss of a baby and was afraid of future childbirth and pregnancy. She had developed this interest in galvanism, not only a scientific interest, but also these terrible dreams she was having about if perhaps she could have brought her baby back to life.
Interest in what, sorry?
Galvanism. So this was what Polidori, who was another of the guests at the Villa Diodati, that famous weekend, he had got her into, and it was the idea that you could reanimate a corpse using electricity, and it was very trendy at the time among intellectuals. So she had that notion in her mind.
I hear there were these kind of exhibitions where a corpse would be brought onto stage and electric shocks put
Exactly.
through
They
it.
would bring like a dead frog, and they would manage to make his legs jump and that sort of thing. So she was fascinated by that. And then, of course, they were holed up in the Villa Diodati during this wet, dark weekend during the summer, the year with no summer, it was called, 1816, because of the volcanic eruption. So the whole of Europe was dark. So that all inspired her state of mind. And then she was looking over at the Alps and this magnificent scenery in the distance. And she and Shelley and Byron and all of the romantics at the time were very taken with this notion of the sublime, which is, it's not beauty or terror, but it's like a combination of the two. And it's the effect that spectacular scenery can have on one's state of mind. And so all that fed into the book. And she was very taken with this idea that if we mess around with nature, bad things will happen. The Mont Blanc is not on our side. It's very much, it's almost a pre-Lovecraftian idea that we can't control nature, and nature is something that we should be afraid of. And look what happens when we try and do something so unnatural as to create a human without a mother. So These were the things that all came together to create this story.
You don't get much in the book about, because we've seen his statue here and we've all seen the various incarnations of the movies, which are probably more famous than the book to some extent in people's kind of, popular culture. And also, before the movies, through the 1800s, apparently this was a very popular thing to put on stage. There were dozens of stage productions, which you can imagine the makeup and special effects and whatever. But every time people had to imagine what the monster looked like. You don't get that many clues, do you? Again, we know it's huge, we know it's ugly in Victor's eyes. But do you get an idea of what this thing looked like in your mind from reading the book?
It's very difficult to know because we are so imbued with the Boris Karloff image and the bolts through the neck and the green face. And but there is an early, I think the first painting of Frankenstein, I have it somewhere on my computer, and he looks much more, maybe is it that? He looks much more like a regular man, like a sort of mythical Greek hero. So it's hard to know what Mary Shelley had in mind, but certainly the constant references to grotesque and demonic and diabolical. I think he's supposed to be really scary looking and horrific. And that's a wonderful contrast with how eloquent he is. He's by far the most intelligent character in the book.
It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m, the rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavoured to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same colour as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shrivelled complexion and straight black lips. Now, it's written, Frankenstein, in it's a series of letters, mostly, so there are several voices, and it is a recounting of a tale by someone else initially, isn't it? By the captain of this ship in the Arctic that Dr. Frankenstein is on as he's trying to pursue the monster across the North Pole or wherever. And some of the letters are between Frankenstein and his relatives left back in Geneva. This is the letter where, and it's based, as we're looking out of this cafe window at Plainpalais, this is from Victor's father. So, my dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix... My dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the date of your return to us, and I was at first tempted to write only a few lines, merely mentioning the day on which I should expect you. But that would be a cruel kindness, and I dare not do it. What would be your surprise, my son, when you expected a happy and glad welcome, to behold, on the contrary, tears and wretchedness? And how, Victor, can I relate our misfortune? William is dead. That sweet child, whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle yet so gay, Victor, he is murdered. I will not attempt to console you, but will simply relate the circumstances of the transaction. Last Thursday, May the 7th, I, my niece, and your 2 brothers went to walk in Plainpalais. The evening was warm and serene, and we prolonged our walk farther than usual. It was already dusk before we thought of returning, and then we discovered that William and Ernest, who had gone on before, were not to be found. We accordingly rested on a seat until they should return. Presently Ernest came and inquired if we had seen his brother. He said that he had been playing with him, that William had run away to hide himself, and that he vainly sought for him and afterwards waited for him a long time, but he did not return. This account rather alarmed us, and we continued to search for him until night fell, when Elizabeth conjectured that he might have returned to the house. He was not there. We returned again with torches, for I could not rest, when I thought that my sweet boy had lost himself and was so exposed to all the damps and dews of night. Elizabeth also suffered extreme anguish. About 5 a.m, I discovered my lovely boy, whom the night before I had seen blooming and active in health, stretched on the grass, livid and motionless. The print of the murderer's finger was on his neck. So this is the first really horrific incident in Frankenstein. And then Plainpalais returns when Victor Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, so he comes back to the city, but I think he can't get into the city because the gates are closed. And right near us is the bastion, the Parc des Bastions, and the walls, so you can still see very much in Geneva the walls, the impregnable walls really of the old city. Plainpalais is outside it. And he ends up in Plainpalais. Okay, yeah, this is good. Here we are. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Geneva. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to pass the night at Secheron, a village at the distance of half a league from the city. The sky was serene, and, as I was unable to rest, I resolved to visit the spot where my poor William had been murdered. As I could not pass through the town, I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat. To arrive at Plainpalais. I'm not entirely sure of the geographics of that, because we're not next to the lake. Yeah. During this short voyage, I saw the lightnings playing on the summit of Mont Blanc. in the most beautiful figures. The storm appeared to approach rapidly, and on landing, I ascended a low hill that I might observe its progress. It advanced. The heavens were clouded, and I soon felt the rain coming slowly in large drops, but its violence quickly increased. I quitted my seat and walked on. Although the darkness and storm increased every minute, and the thunder burst with a terrific crash over my head, it was echoed from Salève, the Jura, and the Alps of Savoy. Vivid flashes of lightning dazzled my eyes, illuminating the lake, making it appear like a vast sheet of fire. Catherine, this talks to, what was the word you're using, the sublime, where it's beautiful, but it's also a vast sheet of fire. It's not very cosy, is it?
Yes, that is a beautiful passage, actually, and you can draw direct links to what was going on with the weather that summer, and you can imagine her sitting in the window, desperate to go for a walk, and watching the lightning over the lake. So when you read passages like that, they're stunning, and you can trace the whole of the horror genre that began right there, but at the same time it was an 18-year-old girl, so sometimes the language seems a little naive, but the structure of the book is incredibly sophisticated, and even now that we can understand all of the influences that created this story, it's really amazing that all of this huge cultural phenomenon all came from that one weekend and that one girl.
I'm going to carry on. So, still on the same page, but he's weeping in grief at the loss of his kind of baby brother or young brother. William, dear angel, this is thy funeral. William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this thy dirge. As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure, which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature and the deformity of his aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. What did he there? Could he be? I shuddered at the conception. The murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination that I became convinced of its truth. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean against a tree for support. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost it in the gloom. Nothing in human shape could have destroyed that fair child. He was the murderer, I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was an irresistible proof of the fact. I thought of pursuing the devil, but it would have been in vain, for another flash discovered him to me hanging among the rocks of the nearly perpendicular ascent of Mont Salève, a hill that bounds Plainpalais on the south. He soon reached the summit and disappeared. I mean, that just in a few lines there, if you know the geography of this place, within a few bounds, this figure that we saw cast in bronze just outside this cafe ran to the Salève, which is a couple of kilometres from here as the crow flies, or through the marshes or whatever this was, and then straight up Yeah, near perpendicular. The Salev is a sheer rock face going up. I'm not sure how high. You can get the cable car up it now, but it shows you the superhuman nature of this character. I mean, what do you make of the monster himself?
Well, as you read in that passage, Victor Frankenstein said that he'd given birth to this monstrous demon. But in fact, he chose to make Frankenstein 8 feet tall. He chose to make him this sort of superhuman figure that could never live with normal humans. He chose to make him grotesque. And he's a terrible parent who abandons his child immediately the moment he sees the child, which if we read that from Mary Shelley's perspective, it's really the first time in literature that someone had articulated the fears of the childbirth process, the fears of motherhood, the fears that you will give birth to a monster, that you will reject your child. So there are many different interpretations of that, but really it shows the incredible selfishness of Victor Frankenstein. He's really a terrible guy.
And then, so this book is written as a series of letters, or a series of points of view, and he pursues, later on, he pursues the monster past the Salev and then up, and this is a journey I believe you've taken yourself, up the River Arve, which, as we said, it just becomes a trickle. It's a little stream by the time you get up into the Alps, where people go skiing or mountain biking or hiking in the summer. You can jump over it at one point up the mountains there. But up there, you've got the Mer de Glace. You have this. It's interesting to note how enormous the ice sheet is in the book, and the fact that it, parts of it, at least in winter, are coming down to the road. Well, it's not there anymore thanks to global warming, right? You can really see how it's shrunk in the last couple of decades, but particularly the last 200 years. But when he gets on top of the ice, he does find the monster. No, he's not looking for the monster. He's looking for to ease his grief and his guilt, and he goes there to commune with nature, or commune with this sublime. But then who turns up on the ice? The monster. And the monster says, you have to listen to my story. And then the voice switches over to what the monster tells him. What do you make of his journey? So the monster is a bunch of body parts we assume stitched together. There's not much in the book about how it's created, right? It's just is created, some kind of life force is put into it. But we know it's ugly, we know it's enormous, we know it's got superhuman powers. What we don't know, and what Victor Frankenstein doesn't know until this point, is turns out it's got an enormous intelligence because it has learnt human language, perhaps several languages, because I believe he listens to peasants in a hut. It's probably German, is it, that he learns? I'm not sure.
German, and I think isn't one of them Turkish or Arabic?
That's
so
right.
he learns several languages, yeah absolutely.
Just by listening,
yeah.
And then he can read, and then he's able to tell Victor what he's done and what have you created and how Creature. I mean, that's an amazing passage, isn't it? The eloquence of this horrific monster.
That's an incredible scene where he comes running across the ice. That whole journey that Victor Frankenstein takes is, as you said, him looking for comfort, which he certainly didn't deserve, but he was traveling along the Arve, and the Arve very much reflected his mood swings. Sometimes it was troubled and angry, sometimes it was calm and soothed, and so he becomes at one with the river, which was very much what I was trying to do on my journey as well. And then when they have this confrontation at the Mer de Glace, Frankenstein, the monster's ultimate request is that Victor now creates him a wife, because he doesn't want to be alone. And Victor ultimately can't bring himself to do it.
He says he will to start with.
He starts making it, in fact, and then he destroys this lady monster before he gets to the end.
I like that, lady monster.
But I think that's the point, that she was a lady monster, and his fear was not so much that they might marry and procreate, these two monsters. He was afraid that this lady monster might not want to marry the guy monster and might want to go off on her own. And so that was his expression of fear of female autonomy. And again, it all comes back to this proto-feminism that Mary Shelley was writing about, very much like her mother, in fact.
Tell us about her mother. So, I mean, the amazing thing about Frankenstein is it's a first in so many ways. It's a first gothic novel, perhaps. It's, some people say, the first science fiction novel, but it's got all these themes running through, and one of them is feminism. And so remind us then, Mary Shelley, this slip of a girl really, has two very important famous parents, particularly her mother.
Yes, she came from a very intellectual background, and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women. And then she died giving birth to Mary. And that was a burden that Mary always carried. And we can see that burden in her writing, because she had this terrible fear of childbirth, of abandoning her own children, of her children rejecting her or killing her. And she... We can't use the word feminist because it would be an anachronism, but when you think about all of the male characters in the book, they don't come across fantastically well. They're all very selfish, and the women really get screwed over in Frankenstein. I mean, Justine gets wrongly executed for the murder of William.
Right, she's a maid, is she? She's kind of a working class girl
Yes.
in Geneva who gets, not framed, but they just... There's insubstantial evidence, but enough to basically execute her for the murder, the one we've just been talking about.
Well, the monster hides William's locket in her dress, I think. So there is evidence, but I mean, Victor Frankenstein knows very well that she didn't do it, but he allows her to be executed, which is one of the most annoying things to me in the book. I can't bear it when that happens.
Right, because he's not told anyone.
Exactly.
Listen, everyone, it might actually be a monster. Because they don't know about the monster, they wouldn't believe it, or if they did believe it, he's at fault, basically. He's done something awful.
Indeed, well, he sacrifices her to save himself. Elizabeth, his wife, dies on her wedding night, which is extremely symbolic. Mary Shelley associated marriage with death, and there couldn't have been a stronger statement of that than Elizabeth being murdered on her wedding night. And also, when Victor goes off for years to create his monster, Elizabeth doesn't get to go with him. The women very much have to stay in the home. They don't get to go on adventures. So there are all sorts of statements in the book about feminism, and the strongest statement of all is this idea that women are the ones who give birth, and if men try to create a world without women, look what happens. How
did you travel up the Alve? You drove a car and stopped off places? Did you hike? What was it?
I walked. But because I am a mother of school children, I set very strict rules for myself that I had to do everything in between the school runs. So I would do loops, and then I would get to a certain point, and then the next time I would drive to the next point along. So it took me longer than it should have done. But I walked the whole length, yeah.
So this is him. He started his journey on horseback up the Alve, so he's just doing this to clear his head in a way. Immense glaciers approach the road. Immense glaciers approached the road. I heard the rumbling thunder of the falling avalanche and marked the smoke of its passage. Mont Blanc, the supreme and magnificent Mont Blanc, raised itself from the surrounding aiguille, and its tremendous dome overlooked the valley. These sublime and magnificent scenes afforded me the greatest consolation that I was capable of receiving. They elevated me from all littleness of feeling, and although they did not remove my grief, they subdued and tranquilized it. Subdued and tranquilized it. You say he doesn't deserve this. You're very, very harsh on poor Victor, who's in anguish at this point.
He is in anguish, but there are many things he could have done better, I think. But the writing about the Alps is some of the most beautiful in the book, I think. I think she surpasses Percy Shelley and the things that she writes. And they did take this journey together. And this idea of the sublime took hold of all the romantics at this time, and it's what sent all of the first tourists up there. And what I loved is when I was on my journey, I took the book with me and I would read the passages about the places where I was. And even though now we have the noise of the traffic and we have factories and buildings everywhere, I still felt the same feelings that Dr. Frankenstein felt, and that was quite reassuring that we can still understand the sublime. Even though, because we have tampered with nature, we may not have the Mont Blanc being Blanc for much longer.
Another thing you notice is his sudden mood swings, sudden from elation to depths of despair. So here he is. I remained in a recess of the rock, gazing on this wonderful and stupendous scene. The sea, or rather the vast river of ice, wound among its dependent mountains, whose aerial summits hung over its recesses. Their icy and glittering peaks shone in the sunlight over the clouds. My heart, which was before sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I exclaimed, "Wandering spirits, if indeed ye wander, and do not rest in your narrow beds, allow me this faint happiness, or take me as your companion away from the joys of life." As I said this, I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance advancing towards me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice, among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of a man. I was troubled. A mist came over my eyes, and I felt a faintness seize me, but I was quickly restored by the cold gale of the mountains. I perceived, as the shape came nearer, sight tremendous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait his approach and then close with him in mortal combat. He approached. His countenance bespoke bitter anguish, combined with disdain and malignity, while its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes. But I scarcely observed this. Rage and hatred had at first deprived me of utterance, and I recovered only to overwhelm him with words expressive of furious detestation and contempt. "Devil!" I exclaimed, "do you dare approach me? And do you not fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Begone, vile insect, or rather stay, that I may trample you to dust, and oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered." "I expected this reception," said the demon. "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You purpose to kill me." This is chapter 11. The kindness of Victor Frankenstein, he says, "I will give the monster a chance because I created him to tell his story," and this is his story. It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. All the events of that period appear confused and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time, and it was, indeed, a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my various senses. By degrees, I remember, a stronger light pressed upon my nerves, so that I was obliged to shut my eyes. Darkness then came over me and troubled me. But hardly had I felt this when, by opening my eyes, as I now suppose, the light poured in upon me again. I mean, he's describing birth, really. This is someone who's born fully formed, but has no idea what his senses are. You're the mother of children. I have a child. I remember, you hold a newborn baby. That creature is created perfectly human and fully formed. However, it has no idea of, that's why babies stare at their feet. Like, what is this thing? It doesn't know what it is or why it's there. And I guess we could all have that kind of confusion in life, right?
Yeah, it's crazy science fiction. It really is the beginning of the science fiction genre. And I first read Frankenstein when I was a teenager, and I think going back and reading it as a parent and as an older person, you definitely have a different interpretation of passages such as that. Yeah, and you can see how Mary Shelley had suffered because of various aspects of the birth process.
So let's talk about your own writing. It seems very dark, what you write about. Tell us about, what are the favourite books you've written, or and how would you sell it? What's your elevator pitch to a potential reader or publisher, although you have a publisher?
About my writing in general, yeah, dark, gothic, weird, I think. I've only been a fiction writer until now. I have a crime fiction series which is set in Liverpool, where I'm from, and it is an occult crime fiction series, so it has a slight, not quite supernatural element, but it has a gothic element. So there's 4 books in that series. And then as I got more into becoming a real Genevoise, I wrote a book about Geneva, which is called All the Parts of the Soul, and that is about witchcraft and Calvin in the 16th century. And that came out last year. And that was a fascinating way to get to know the city even more, because I did a huge amount of research for that. And then I have another book called Buried Lightning, which is coming out next year, and that is kind of cosmic horror, which is inspired by CERN. It's all about magnetism and lightning. And it's also dark, a bit less dark than the others. It has a romance element too. So those are my fiction books, and I'm now writing about the River Arve. So if that comes off, that will be my first non-fiction book.
And what's that, a tourist guide? Is it a travel memoir? What kind of thing would it be?
I guess it falls under the genre of women's nature writing, which is very popular right now. It was about me going for a walk as a stay-at-home mum, trying to find herself both geographically and emotionally in a new city. And I was very taken with this idea that if I could get to know a whole river, it would make me feel more sort of a part of this place. And there's a very famous quote by Nan Shepherd, the nature writer, about how you can't know a river until you can get to know its source. So I was obsessed with this idea of getting to the source of the River Arve, and that became very tied up with my rereading of Frankenstein, because of course it was the same journey. So it became quite a literary journey as well, and on the way, I was discovering some of the first explorers who took that journey, and some of the other writers like Rousseau and Chateaubriand who made the journey. So it's a kind of memoir / travelogue / nature writing, because of course there's a lot of ecology that comes into it, because the Arve has been terribly treated and polluted. And I found that when you get to the other side of the Mont Blanc, so from Geneva, where I live, you just see this big white thing in the sky, and it almost doesn't seem real. It just looks so ethereal and magical. But when you get closer, it's still magnificent, and you have these glittering blue glaciers. But when you get to the source of the Arve and you can see it from the other side, there's something a little bit vulnerable about it. And I actually found myself tearing up when I got to the source of the Arve, looking at the Mont Blanc.
What is the source? Is it the meltwater coming off the glacier? What do you actually see?
It comes out of a place called the Col de Balme, which is one of the mountains in the Mont Blanc range. So you can see the Mont Blanc from there. It's next to the Argentière glacier. And when I was up there, all I could hear was the rushing of meltwater from this glacier. And then there was something quite vulnerable about the Mont Blanc, because from that angle there was quite a lot of green as well. And it just made me think that in my children's lifetimes, it might not be white anymore. It might be green.
And as tourists to Chamonix may know, you can get that train that goes up, an old electric train from 100 years ago, I think. And you wonder why, when it stops, the glacier's nowhere near. It's, why would they build it to there? Of course, when they built it, the glacier was there. Yeah. But now you have to climb down. It takes ages down all these staircases. Have you been to this?
To go into the cave.
Yeah. You can go inside the glacier. They've hollowed it out. It's still a lovely thing, but it is desperately sad because they've marked on those staircases, this is the level it would have been at in 1987, and as you went down in 1963 or whatever, down and down. So yeah, it is. Again, it's the beauty, but also the sadness of it, I think. Yeah,
it's very poignant. And when you travel along the River Arve, in lots of places there are these boards where the Arve management company is explaining how they're improving the Arve and how they talk about renaturalization and rewilding. And that's great, but a part of me thinks, well, we shouldn't really congratulate ourselves for just turning it back into the way it was before. I think because the Arve is this murky colour, it's always been quite a good way to hide all sorts of other things that you can put into it.
Okay. Oh, that's a shame. You've burst my bubble there, because I see this beautiful mountain river rushing down towards this city, and think, oh, that's the pure waters of the Alps. You're telling me it's not as pure as I would
Well,
hope.
I think it's much cleaner than it used to be. I think they've made huge improvements. But it's, what's the word they used to call it? In lots of parts of the Arve, it's hypertrophic, is that the word? Which means hostile to life, because it is so very cold and it has so much sediment in it. So there are certain areas where they have lots of fish and certain areas where they have none. But I do love how it changes colour depending on the season, depending on how much and what it's carrying. It has different loads. I feel very connected to that river. It's my friend.
Catherine Ferns is an author and musician. Look out for her forthcoming book, retracing the steps of Percy and Mary Shelley, and indeed of Victor Frankenstein and his monster, up the River Arve from Geneva all the way to Chamonix and Mont Blanc. Back in Geneva itself and to the old town, firmly inside the medieval city walls, unlike Plainpalais. In the middle of the old town, on the cobbled Grand Rue that crosses it, is the Société de Lecture, the Reading Society, a library, a meeting place which, by coincidence, was founded the year Frankenstein was first published in 1818. That's where I met Anne Eckhout, a Dutch author who was presenting the new English language translation of her novel Mary, or The Birth of Frankenstein. It's a reimagining of Mary's summer holiday in Geneva in 1816, with Byron and Shelley and the others, and also a part of her life 4 years earlier when, aged 14, she travelled from her London home to stay with a family in Dundee, Scotland. So another book like Frankenstein firmly rooted in place, but unlike Mary Shelley, Anne Eckhout had, thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, not even been able to visit Geneva before writing her book. Finally here, I asked Anne Eckhout to set out what her book is about.
I think it's the origin story of a Frankenstein, but from a whole other perspective, because the summer in 1812 had been so important for her, for the development of her imagination, for writing Frankenstein. And those periods, the one in 1812 and the one in 1816, when she actually started writing Frankenstein, they never have been really linked. Not in a way that I have found anyway. And tomorrow I'm gonna see Villa Diodati, so I'm really excited about that. So I really wanted to let people know the story of what happened in Dundee, or what could have happened and what could have inspired Mary Shelley to actually write Frankenstein.
So I'm really interested for this podcast about locations, and here we sat in this incredible place, the Société de Lecture, which I've just discovered this evening, actually.
Me too.
Right.
Yeah.
We're surrounded by these historical books. This place has been here exactly as long to the year as Frankenstein, the novel, has been here. They were both created in 1818, which is quite something.
Really amazing, yes.
But what I was interested in your talk there, you said you weren't able to come here to research the location because your book is set in two places, in Dundee in Scotland, where Mary Shelley is 14, and here in Geneva, when she's writing Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. How could you write about Geneva or Lake Geneva or these locations which, without actually having seen them and been here?
Yeah, it was very daunting to write about the places I haven't been to, but fortunately we have the internet, and we have all kinds of books and history books. And
did you get onto Google Street View?
Yes, also, but of course, unfortunately, Google Street View doesn't do 200 years back. That would be something. But of course, I traveled with Google through Geneva and through Dundee, and also parts of London, because of course she lived a lot of her life there, and Bath, and all kinds of places. And I tried to get a few images of the places she has been to, and to go from there, to let my imagination run free, and to try to get a real sense of being there. But of course, if you write fiction that doesn't have any historic background, you have to make up scenery as well. And of course, this had to be just right. I thought it was a bit scary to embark on such a project.
Well, scary's good with Frankie. So.
Yes, I think it is.
You're a woman creating a story, and this is, your fourth novel, but the first one translated into English. Mm-hmm. Were you channeling anything from Mary Shelley there? You're creating, just like the professor's creating a new life or something. Do you feel that, or am I romanticising way too much? The life of an author, someone creating something, bringing life where there was nothing before.
Well, I think it is a bit like that, but I really wanted to give Mary Shelley, or my character of Mary Shelley, the opportunity to link the story of Frankenstein to her own life. And it's kind of like, I don't know if you have that saying in English, or in Dutch we say a droste effect. It's like an image inside an image, inside an image, inside an image. And that's like what this feels like. You've got Mary Shelley, who is writing Frankenstein, which is also a sort of a birth itself, like Dr. Frankenstein gave birth to the monster, and there I am giving birth to a story about Mary Shelley, who's giving birth to. Right. So that felt really good to do.
Mm-hmm. Any feelings on being in Geneva? Having written this?
I'm so glad being here. It's it finally falls into place a bit. It's, of course, it must have been very different more than 200 years ago, but it's really great to get a sense of the place where she began writing.
Anne Eickhout, her book is called Mary, or the Birth of Frankenstein. And if you're still unconvinced of the cultural impact of what happened in Geneva in that year without a summer more than 200 years ago, just ask yourself, who is still reading Frankenstein today? Well, my daughter Asal was chatting with her AI assistant. I happened to ask the Amazon smart speaker the following question.
Alexa, what's your favourite book?
My absolute favourite book is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I learned a lot about what it means to be human.
You can visit the places mentioned in this podcast, Byron's Field in Cologne, the Frankenstein statue in Plainpalais, and follow the River Arve up to Chamonix. Check out links in the show notes and on the website, abookaplace.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode of A Book a Place Geneva. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a rating on whichever app you're using, and maybe even a review, and please tell your friends to check it out. If they like history or books, or they're curious about the hidden history of Geneva, there's sure to be something of interest in this or forthcoming episodes. Make sure you subscribe to or follow A Book a Place Geneva on your podcast app to get the next episode when it drops. And talking of the next episode, next time on A Book a Place Geneva.
Faster than a speeding bullet.
Comic books or graphic novels have been around for what, a century? Perhaps more? Where did they spring from? The America of the superheroes?
Superman!
The Belgium of Tintin, perhaps?
Hergé's Adventures of Tintin!
What about Japan that gave us manga and anime? The real answer may surprise you.
Comics were born in Geneva much earlier, in 1833.
Part history podcast, part book club, part travel guide. A Book a Place Geneva looks at the stories behind the stories.
Comics were created by this gentleman, Mr. Rodolphe Topfer. You will find some of his first books on the table right here.
Subscribe to A Book a Place Geneva to hear the surprising story of the world's first ever comic books, which were championed by the greatest writer of the day and read across Europe 200 years ago.
Goethe loved those stories.
Available on your podcast app and at abookaplace.com.